Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here with me on the Entrepreneurial Success Podcast. I'm really thrilled to have you here, and we've got some exciting things to talk about today. But before we get started, why did I hand over to you and you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Okay, thank you, Henriette. Yes, so I'm Rachel Maunder, and I work primarily with emerging speakers, is the phrase I've kind of come up with, to help them find and craft their stories into their speaking. By doing that, they just make themselves more vulnerable when they're speaking, make themselves more human, but more importantly than that, they make themselves much more engaging, which means that ultimately they're likely to get more business as a result.
Yeah, and I love that because we both know how important storytelling is in business in particular. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about how you got started and how you got into this business and how that's evolved to where you are now.
Well, it's a long story, so I'll try and cut it short for you. I mean, my own sort of public speaking started in the courtroom, in the juvenile courtroom, and that's going a long way back, where I actually worked for a local authority, and through a series of different jobs ended up doing a lot of the advocacy in childcare cases, and absolutely loved it. And at that point decided that I would love to be a barrister, which I know is a very different kind of public speaking, but it's still speaking in public. Alongside that, doing bits of training and really enjoying facilitating and all of that. I did get a place to start my training, to start converting the degree I had to become a barrister. But at the same point, my then partner got offered a job in Thailand for 2 years, and it was like, oh, which do I do? Went to Thailand. We ended up staying there for 9 years, came back married with 2 young children. So my life was very different by the time I came back, and I decided that actually the barrister route was not going to allow me to parent in the way I wanted to parent, basically. So different things then happened. Back in 2010, another key turning point was that I took out a franchise with the Athena network. And that's how I've met you, obviously. And again, therefore, running meetings with 20 or 30 people in the room. So a different form of speaking again. But it was during that time that I thought, actually, I really like this thing of speaking. And I joined Toastmasters, which is a very useful organization to be part of to improve your speaking skills. And I was on this trajectory then towards becoming or making speaking a much bigger part of my life. And quite quickly, I realized that, I was already confident and reasonably competent at it. Other people in my Athena network were not so I started running some training for them. But in terms of the story piece, when I hadn't been a member of Toastmasters very long, when I went along to a final round of their annual competitions and was completely blown away by people that won it and were placed second and third, and my whole thing was, oh, I want to be on that stage, that's going to be me this time next year. And then sort of analysing what they had in common and realising that they'd all shared what I call a big story, and that might be where they've achieved something amazing. And I thought, oh, so I haven't really got a story, how can I? But I did carry on with the speaking, and I did get onto that stage the following year, but I wasn't placed. And quite soon after that, I realised that actually Toastmasters, although I still had a lot to learn from it, and I think it's a great organisation for that, there's something about the Toastmasters style of speaking which was not what I was aspiring to. So I also joined the Professional Speaking Association, where you see a huge variety of speakers. And so continuing to improve my speaking, but the feedback was always the same. It was, competent presentation, really clear message. We'd like to hear a bit more about you. We'd like to hear your story. And I think, I've got a story. But people kept saying, oh, but you have loads. And I think, no, I don't. So this went on for a while. And I did sort of try and focus on my pain points in my life and think, well, is this what I'm here to speak about? But neither of those sat comfortably because they weren't things that had really impacted my life, even though they could have done to other people that had experienced them, but they weren't for me, so it wouldn't have been genuine to me. And I don't quite know why, but probably about a year ago, I suddenly woke up to the fact that they were right. These people that told me that I did have hundreds of stories, that actually I do, and we all do. We have hundreds and hundreds of ordinary everyday stories. And I also realised at that point, I'd already been using those to inspire other people to take action. Because one of the things that I do, I send out a weekly tip on a Monday morning to my list, and there'll often be just a little more of a vignette than a story, but there'll be a reflection on something that I've experienced and inviting them to think about things in a different way. So it all seemed to come together. And actually, the change that has happened within the last few months really came as a result of a question from my business coach is, what exactly is it that you do? You do too many things. I don't know who to recommend you to say, you need to go and speak to Rachel. So, of course, this was mid-lockdown, all of this sort of stuff going on where I was sort of sitting and weighing up all the different things I offered, which mostly were all around communication skills. But they included networking, they included mindset and resilience and confidence building, but they did include the presentation skills. But I realised at that point that actually the one thing, if I had to choose one thing, it would be the speaker coaching, and my real sweet spot is helping people not only find their story, but to say to them, that's a really good point at which to start talking about your story. And I just feel, others might not agree, but I feel I have a real knack in helping people find that point to start their story. So yeah, that's how we get here.
It's amazing. I love it. And you and I have met before, and there was an instant connection when you and I first chatted, because I'm so passionate about storytelling as well, because I know the importance of it. And I mean, that's why, when you were a kid, you were engrossed in books, and the teachers in class were reading you books, and your parents were reading you bedtime stories and all those things, because that's where the imagination comes to light. That's where you start making up those pictures and you start resonating with it. And I think people sometimes forget that storytelling is really one of the key things, not just any storytelling, but your story. And this is going to segue very nicely into what we want to teach here, because I had a chat with a lovely lady one day, and I asked her, I always call it your success story. And I said to her, I said, what is your success story? And she's like, I don't have a success story. And it's like, no, you do. You honestly do. What is your story? Just tell me. She's like, well, I have a story maybe, but it's not successful. It's like, no. Every story is successful. Every one of us is on a journey that is so unique and so different from one another that is a success by itself. And once she got that light bulb moment, she's like, oh, well, then I've got a long story to tell you. But I love that, because I think what you want to teach us today is also that everybody's got a story, and the importance of that story and the importance of sharing that story. So why don't I hand over to you, and you start us off and just tell us a little bit about the importance maybe of sharing your success story.
Yeah, I mean, it can, as you say, it's always a success story. And if the only success is that it inspires somebody else to do something. And for me, the importance is you never know how far reaching your story is. I mean, my overall mission is to inspire 1 million people to share their stories. I'm not going to be involved with those 1 million people. It just comes down. I'm going to inspire maybe 100 people to throw their pebble in the pond to create those ripples, because my whole thing comes down to that someone somewhere needs to hear your ordinary everyday story today in order to make probably a small change in one aspect of their life, and who knows where that's going to lead. Now, it might be a change in their career. Your story might inspire them to set up their own business or whatever it is. Might inspire them to make it some kind of change in their relationship, in their life in general, their fitness. I don't know what it would be. But when you think of the things that will have triggered you in the past to make those changes, it will nearly always be something somebody has told you. And certainly I know that often things I know I've heard something before, like this thing about, oh, of course you have a story, but it only really connects at the right point when you're ready to hear it.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean, that someone needs to hear your story today, because you might have been telling it, and not be aware that you've made a difference to anybody, but somebody hearing it today would just make that difference. And who knows where that's going to end? Absolutely, who knows? They might go on to do something great in their lives just because they heard your story, which would be completely different to their own story, their own mission, but it would be just something that triggered them to make a change.
Yeah, and that's why we're here talking about it, because the audience now listening, they've already listened to your story, and something in there might have triggered something for them, going like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant, this is just what I needed. But also with the information that we're going to share with them today, I'm sure like they're all sitting there with their pen and their notebooks, like ready, waiting for all the information, because everybody needs to realize how important it is to share a story. And it's not just something you're making up, it is something that is really true and authentic and aligned with you.
I think the problem is they don't know what that story is, and that's where I can help them. But I mean, just to illustrate this, it was illustrated beautifully with somebody who, again, I know through Athena. I've known her for 3 years reasonably well, but I didn't know something that was going on in her life personally. No reason why I should. But she attended, I mean, obviously she's heard me talk about storytelling because she's been at Athena meetings with me. But she came to one of my masterclasses, and something that I said in that masterclass really inspired her. Whether it was that thing about someone needs to hear your story, I'm not quite sure, because we haven't had a conversation about that yet. But 2 days later, she put out a video on Facebook sharing her personal challenge, and as a result of that, 5 people that recognize the symptoms that she faces came back to her to say, thank you so much for sharing. I think I have the same situation as you, and I'm now going to go and get help for it. So hearing that just really sent shivers down my spine, because I thought, wow, that is so powerful. Nothing to do with me in a sense, and if I hadn't known the person involved, I might never known that had happened. And if that's 5 that came back to her, there might have been another 5, another 50, who knows? They, as a result, go on and share their story and inspire somebody else, we quite quickly reach that 1 million.
Yeah. What would you say then to somebody who is now listening to this and go like, okay, well, you're saying that I've got a story to share, but I don't really have anything. My life is pretty boring.
I would say go back and look at all those, because when people come on my story hunt session, I send them out a questionnaire just to start getting their thinking going. I would say, first of all, if you're serious about hunting for your story, get yourself a notebook and make sure it goes everywhere with you, including on your bedside table at night, because all of a sudden a story will come to mind. And the more you start thinking about them, think, oh yeah, well, I could tell that story. Believe me, that it will pop back out of your head just as quickly as it came in. So you only need a couple of bullet points, something about, fish and chip shop when I was 13, whatever it is, because you'll remember when you see that. But I would also say go back to, maybe early childhood, if you have memories from there, the key turning points in your life, holidays, first experience of a different culture, and really listen to other people's stories and think, have you got a story that's similar to that? Because there will be. Now, one thing I have found is that some people still really struggle to actually share those individual stories, but if people like that, there will usually be a theme. So again, just to give you an example of that, somebody I worked with, so she now runs an online magazine, and her whole thing is about really supporting and helping her advertisers. I mean, obviously her readers as well, but her advertisers are the people that invest in the magazine. And when we looked back, she has a series of things that had happened throughout her life where she's in that supportive, putting somebody else in the limelight, by doing her thing in the background. So that would work just as well as sharing individual stories. So there will always be something.
Yeah. And I think it is so lovely because, like you said, we all have so many stories to share. And most people would say, like, well, why do I need to share my stories? Apart from the reason that people can resonate with it. But I think also is if you have a message to deliver, stories are the best way to deliver that message. Apart from just, you know, people having a pivoting moment where they go like, oh my gosh, it is about, as an example, I'm a coach. So I use stories all the time and analogies in order to explain things.
Yes.
Because sometimes when you just go into the bullet points and you just try and teach people something, it wouldn't really make a big as an impact when you just teach. But if you use analogies and if you use stories in order to teach that, immediately people have that visual in their mind and it just sits there and they feel like this is it. This is something that I really needed right now to learn from you as an individual.
Yes.
And I think that's why stories are so important and why you say we can never run out of stories because there's so much happening. You don't have to use your own examples. You use examples of other people sometimes as well. But you have to use stories all the time, whether you want to get a message through, whether you want to teach something. Stories are the future. It always has been.
Yes, and actually what you've alluded to there, Henriette, is the overriding thing. Yes, you have got hundreds of stories, but you need to be able to pull out some learning from it. And it doesn't have to be learning that you necessarily picked up at the time. And each story, each one of your ordinary everyday stories could probably be used to illustrate 3 or 4 different learning points. And equally, each learning point that you want to convey, you could use 3 or 4 different stories. And as you say, it needs to be your story and that you need to be involved in some way. So it could be that it's a client story, because obviously you're involved with that client, or it can be something that happens to somebody else that you've witnessed, or that you know, it needs to be your angle on it. What it absolutely mustn't be is using somebody else's story and saying it's your own. If you'd shared a story with me that was valuable, and if I'd asked you if it was okay to do so, I could use your story and say one of my business colleagues, this is what happened to her, and that's fine. But what wouldn't be all right is to think, well, that's a good story, I'm going to say it's mine. You'll get caught out if you do that, and it's, I know most people don't do it, but you do hear of it happening. So
and the thing is it's not authentic, it's not aligned with you, so people can immediately read through your energy when it doesn't come through right. Now, one of the questions that I have for you is we talk about stories now, and there's so many stories happening during our lives that we can use on a daily basis, but I think everybody, for us as businesswomen, there's this one main story that we're not always sure about. And this is the story that you tell somebody when you meet them the first time. This is the story that might be on the about page of your website. This might be the story that you really need to use as an introduction for people. And I think that's where people sometimes struggle very much so, because I've had so many questions about the about page. What do I put on the about page? What do I talk about? Do I talk about too much, too little? But what kind of advice can you give somebody when it comes to that one principle, that one unique story about themselves that they need to tell?
Well, I think I would say try and keep it brief. What we don't necessarily want is a whole life history of your, everything you've ever done. But what we do want is the things that are relevant. But I think my piece of advice would be actually to talk that through with somebody else. Because just to give you one of my own examples, and it's not necessarily relevant to what I'm doing now, so it's not on my about page anymore, but prior to this sort of narrowing of my business services, if you like, I was addressing professional brand or personal brand as a whole. And in particular, I was wanting to elevate the position of women in corporates in the professions where they're underrepresented, so law, finance. But I was never about wanting to push women forward at the expense of men. I was all about wanting balance. And that is one of the things. you know, it's a sort of a positive thing, and sometimes can be a curse. I can always see the other side of a story. So balance is a thing. Now, I actually worked with a copywriter to write my about page. She asked me to tell me my life story, and I was actually a magistrate for 4 or 5 years. Years ago, to me, it was no longer relevant because it was connected with the job that I had at the time. But she said, oh, but well, one, it's really interesting because most people aren't magistrates. And two, it shows that not only do you have a natural ability to see balance, but you've had training in it as well, because that's exactly what a magistrate does. So I think unless you know what your story is that brings you to be doing what you're doing, because it's partly that, it's partly the interest of your pathway to be doing what you're doing, which, you know, I've already explained to you very briefly. But it's also the credibility piece of why somebody might be able to see that you're good at what you're doing. So it could be, and this is some stuff that comes up really, really nicely when I'm working with clients. And one that I thought was really nice that came up the other day, I'm working with a guy who's in the IT world. So he's got such a brilliant mind that when you ask him to tell a story, he very, very quickly gets into techno jargon, and I'm like, whoa, you've lost me already. And I couldn't quite find a way of getting a story from him, because it would straight away go into his education. And I said, did you play with robots when you were a kid? And immediately he changed, and he said, and he smiled, and he said, well, I didn't so much play with them as want to know how I could make them better and how they worked. But for me, that's a lovely sort of human aspect to this man who works in a very dry industry, because everybody can sort of picture this very bright little boy who loves this robot but actually wants to improve it and sits down and draws out a graph of how he would make a better one. But it's also a huge credibility piece for what he's doing. So
no, that's absolutely a lovely story, and I love hearing it because it just shows the importance. I mean, it's like you said, when you talked about this little boy playing or looking at this robot, immediately everybody here just had that image in their head, and that's what you want to create. That's what is so important. So as an example, I always personally, when I talk about what I do, and I can only talk for myself and use my own example now, I always start by saying I joke when I talk about myself and say I was plucked from the bush, because I'm from a small town in the heart of South Africa, which was so small it only had one traffic light and it was always green. Right. And that's how I start my story. And people go like, oh my gosh, that is so different, so unique. But that's how I start my story and how I go into my story, because number one, it's true. Number two, I know that I always like people to chuckle a little bit and bring a little bit of humor in it, but I want people to visualize something. And some people can, it's like one traffic light, just one traffic light. How is that possible? But I know that that is kind of a way of me bringing my story to life and then going into that. And I think when people kind of grasp how they can create their story, trust me, it took me a long time to get there. But once you're in that position to graft your own story, it makes a world of difference.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think the temptation, and obviously for you, because that is something very different, something unusual, and you found a good point, but people have that tendency to start at the beginning and tell their story all the way through. And that's not always going to be the most interesting things. It's like, you know, one of the exercises I do on my group program, we start with creating a professional bio. Nobody wants to hear for most of us that we were born here and educated there, unless it's particularly unusual or particularly relevant or particularly unusual, you know, different to what the expectations that might come from that background. So for example, if you had somebody that was educated at Eton and Oxford and is now living the good life in the middle of Asia or something, then that might be interesting. But for most of us, where we were born and grew up isn't the most interesting place to start. Might not need to be included at all. So it's knowing where is the point of interest. And as you said, it's you want the audience listening from that first moment, or reading if it's on your about page. So it's knowing where to start it. And that's where having somebody else to go through it with you can really help with that. Because they can say, oh, that's an interesting bit.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so powerful, because it's that same old question, where do we start? I mean, for such a long time, I never started talking about where I was from. But because it was so unique, I realized I had to bring it in. And that is what captured my audience. And then obviously, you know, I skip quite a few years and then I talk about what I do now. But I think it is so important because for each and every one of us, it's so unique. It's just
Yes.
finding those highlights, putting them together and having that story that you can share with people. What can you then give us as tips? So we obviously talked about, you know, starting off with, where do you start? Basically, do you start from the beginning? Do you start from a certain point? What kind of tip can you give somebody in order to, let's say, figure out where it needs to end? Because we talked about the beginning, but what about the end?
The ending is, well, there's, as with all these things, there's several ways of doing it, but one that's very powerful is if you can bring it back to the beginning. And by that I mean, you know, one speaker I've heard, he starts as he's about to reach the summit of Everest, and then he goes back and takes us through his journey, from the point that he decided he'd do it, the planning, the preparation, the climb, and then we come back to him reaching the summit. So that brings it in a nice loop. Equally, it can be maybe you pose a question or a statement at the beginning that you might then want to come back to in the end. I do this in my talk. I talk about when I was in that stage of not thinking I had a story and people kept telling me I did. I think, well, who do I think I am to be telling my story when there's all these people that have done these amazing things? And, you know, I managed to turn that on its head for myself, you know, way before I started recognizing all my stories. But I think, well, actually, if I can make a difference to somebody, who do I think I am not to share it? So again, bringing it back to where I started, without having an example, it's hard. There's no general principle, but it needs to all flow and come back to where you started in some form or other, I would say.
Yeah, I do like that, because actually I've seen some movies like that where they show this thing and it's so dramatic when the movie starts, and then they go 6 months earlier.
Yes. Yes.
And you go, oh, okay, let's see how they got there.
Yes.
But
it's
the same thing.
Stories. Yeah, it doesn't, but it's not the best way of telling every story.
Yeah, true.
Like yours, you say you were plucked from the bush. Well, that's your beginning, isn't it, in a sense? And that's still a very, very good start. So yeah, but I would say definitely think about, ask, even if you don't want to get professional help, just talk about it to a few people, and ask them where's the points of interest for them, because that would always be the starting point. Probably, I suppose, the finish needs to bring them to that point of learning from what you've just said.
Yeah. But Rachel, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here with me and just sharing all of these amazing tips. It's been absolutely lovely. And you kind of inspired me now to go and look at my own story a little bit, and to, just keep on making notes of stories coming up, because I think sometimes I sometimes myself struggle, and I'm thinking, I want to write this one piece of information or this one blog or this one piece of content. I'm going, what story do I have to connect with it? But I guess it's so important, once you have that notebook with you, you know, you can really just delve onto any kind of story in there. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure you and I will be in touch fairly soon again.
I'm sure you will, Henriette. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Take care.